Welcome to day 2 of the BRE Cities Convention. Yesterday went really well. I wasn't here, but I have some really good reports from those who were, and it was a very interesting day, and I think those of you who were here yesterday will have agreed with that comment. My name's Chris Broadbent. I'm one of the growing band of civil engineers at BRE, and my role is to lead as director our infrastructure activities, and that's partly to do with the work we do in testing and in materials development and in innovation, which we do for buildings and for the whole infrastructure sector as well. But also it's about BREEAM and extending the methodology that we have in BREEAM to the infrastructure sector to assess those projects and the sustainability of those projects. Let me now deal with the health and safety announcements. There's not intended to be a fire alarm scheduled to be tested today. If we do hear an alarm, then it will be a requirement to evacuate. We have fire exits here and at the back where you went through to the bar, and from the bar 2 exits either side leading out of the building. Once you're outside the main building, the fire wardens will direct you to a muster point. The fire wardens will be spotted by their luminous jackets, so you won't miss them. And the muster point is just behind the building in the car park on John Islip Street, just behind the Tate Britain gallery. There's an area there marked 6th floor. I don't know quite why it's marked 6th floor, but it is. But that's where we need to stand, and we wait there until security give us an all clear to go back to the building. Toilets are in the lobby, you'll have seen just behind the bar there. If you could switch your phones to silent, that would be much appreciated. And of course, it is a no smoking environment in the building. So this morning's session is all about our city's infrastructure, how we can explore how they contribute towards the economy of the city, how we make sure our cities are fit for purpose through the infrastructure that there is, to balance supply and demand, to how efficient and resilient infrastructure can reduce risks for service providers and users while saving money and valuable resources. We've got 3 great speakers, which I'll introduce shortly. And don't forget, there is an online conversation. If you're onto Twitter, then hashtag Cities Convention is there to use, and do feel free to use that. And also at BRE events, follow us on that and see how people are responding to this day. Our plan is to have 3 presentations now to take us up to a time of questions at the end. So all questions we'll take at the very end, and then we'll lead on to, after questions, a coffee break at 11 o'clock. So just by way of introduction, work this, that's the wrong way. Efficient infrastructure is really important to our cities, for our prosperity of our cities, and forms very much a backbone to the economy. Facilitating business, driving business, it must be developed and improved in order to cities to retain their competitiveness, and cities that tend not to develop and maintain their infrastructure tend to fall into decline. Transport is critical. Our stations, our railways, our airports, our ports are all essential for business, for trade, and for which our cities rely. The infrastructure sector provides the means to move people and to move goods in and out and around, and also to generate the power that we need for our cities to function. The means for cities to grow, to be prosperous, to do business, and to connect. And I think we'll hear about all of those things in our discussions this morning. There are areas of the world where infrastructure struggles to be effective. Maybe it's not fit for purpose, maybe it's old, maybe it's overwhelmed by demand. But we need to make sure that our cities have an infrastructure that is kept up to date, that is renewed, that does meet demand, that is fit for the future, and incorporates an understanding of those needs that the future brings and that we need to provide for. The challenges of climate change are very much to the fore. We're seeing the effects of that. We are seeing increasing and changing demographics. We're seeing urbanisation, resilience against extreme weather impacts, which we heard a bit more about from MacDonald this morning. And all of those, including security threats, are important to be dealt with. And I think we will be hearing about those as we go through the morning as well. But by no means last is our environment, the environment of our cities. We need to make sure our cities are pleasant places to be in, to live and to work, to make sure that the health and well-being of our people is maintained and is critical for their productivity, for their effectiveness in operating in that city environment. And we'll hear a bit more about green infrastructure a bit later on, and how that can help improve our health, the environment, recreation, enjoyment, of all those things that contribute to the energy and productivity of people and the creativity of those who work and live in our cities. And all this is underpinned by and facilitated by the infrastructure that we develop and support and provide within our cities, allowing them to flourish. Creative design, innovative construction, future thinking all encourage these benefits, as do environmental and sustainability standards such as CEQAL and BREEAM. As an aside, BREEAM is being extended currently to include infrastructure projects as well. We saw the Construction 2025 report a year or so ago. We saw the Infrastructure Carbon Review just over a year ago. And all of those are contributing to setting higher standards and to facilitate better outcomes for all of our projects. I think that's probably by far too much for me to say now. I think we need to move on to the more interesting speakers. Let me first introduce John Polak. John is Professor of Transport Demand and Head of the Centre for Transport Studies at Imperial College. He's Director of the Intercollegiate MSc courses in Transport and coordinates the university's transport partnership, specialising in areas of travel, behaviour and transport demand modelling. We're very pleased to have John with us this morning, and I'll just pass over to him now.
Thank you very much. Okay, so Simo, where do I go from here? Just next? No? If I go forward, I become someone else. So forward is not the right answer in this case. Anybody can help me? Yeah. Good, thank you.
Is that the first slide?
No, that's the first one. Thank you. Okay, only it's not showing. Good. Thank you very much. So, and thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the opportunity of speaking here today. I don't have much time, so I want to focus on three issues. The first, to say a little bit about the reason that cities are important. We've heard it from Ian and from others already today, and I'm not going to be telling you there anything you don't know. But perhaps going a little bit beyond that, focusing on an analysis of why infrastructure in cities is problematic. That's the first thing I want to focus on. Second thing I want to focus on is a bit of promotion and public relations. I want to tell you a bit about the Urban Systems Laboratory at Imperial College, and to show you a little bit by way of examples of the project work that we're doing at the moment to address some of the challenges in cities and city infrastructure that I'll discuss under my first heading. And then finally, I want to leave you with some questions. I want to raise in your mind some question marks about what has now become an almost standard canonical rhetoric about cities. One can go to any number of conferences and hear the standard canonical rhetoric about resilience and so on and so on and so on. And I just want to raise one or two questions about that. It's the role of the academic to speak truth to power. So I want to try and do that as well. So to begin with, cities, the big picture. Cities are important for a whole raft of reasons, but they can probably be, these reasons can probably be grouped most effectively under three broad headings. Firstly, they're important culturally, economically, environmentally, institutionally. They're the place where everything is focused. Secondly, they are vulnerable in various ways. Ian was talking earlier about environmental vulnerability or vulnerability to environmental extremes. They're also vulnerable to economic competition, as it were, hostile economic circumstances, and there are also a lot of bad guys out there that want to do us harm. serious harm. So they're vulnerable. And third, and on a day-to-day basis, probably the most important, they don't work very well. I've chosen a nice, polite way of putting that, under enormous pressure to change. But the blunt way of putting that is that they don't work very well. And daily, city dwellers are exposed to multiple episodes, multiple experiences, from the banal and the amusing to the irritating to the frustrating to the appalling. Multiple episodes of experience of cities not working well. And that's got to change. So if we think about city infrastructure and where city infrastructure sits in all of this, I would submit that there are three fundamental reasons why we have problems with cities and city infrastructure of the sort that we're discussing in this conference. The first is to do with the nature of economic processes in cities. Cities exist because of what economists call agglomeration economies, positive agglomeration economies. There is value for businesses and individuals of being close to one another and of being together. And those agglomeration economies in cities are very strong. Successful cities that are defined by positive agglomeration economies. But at the same time, the very processes that lead to those strong positive agglomeration economies also mean that it becomes less and less attractive to introduce new infrastructure. It becomes more and more expensive, more and more complicated, more and more tiresomely bureaucratic to do things in cities, the more complicated and successful those cities become. So there is a fundamental tension there. The agglomeration economies associated with city activities and growth are pointing in the opposite direction to the agglomeration economies associated with city infrastructure. And the bottom line of that is that by and large, in most places, we don't have enough infrastructure to meet the demand, because the demand is growing faster than the capacity of the infrastructure to be provided. And that's not to do with local failures, it's structural. That's the first problem. Second problem is that I've not yet encountered an urban infrastructure system that doesn't suffer from congestion, that isn't congestible. And of course, congestion is a source of frustration on a daily basis for us all in the transport system, in the telecommunications networks, and so on. But it's more than that. The effect of congestion means that we impose costs on others that we don't see ourselves. That's a fundamental characteristic of a congestible system. So you'll have all had the delightful experience, as I did earlier, of coming upstairs this morning in the lift. So we all crunched in there, and we all individually felt a little crushed. Fine. But what we didn't feel was the crush that we were causing for everybody else. And that's a fundamental example, an example of a fundamental property in congestible systems, that we impose costs on the system that we do not perceive ourselves. We bear some of those costs, but not fully. And the result of that is that infrastructure will tend not to be used in the most economically efficient way, because the signals that come back from the price systems that operate in congestible infrastructures are wrong. And the third problem again, is one that Ian touched on in his opening discussions, is that city infrastructures are increasingly interdependent in all sorts of ways that are obvious, and I won't take time to explain. But what they are not is coordinated. So you've got a system in which you've got interdependence but weak coordination. And part of the problem there is no one owns the interfaces. No one is responsible for the interfaces. And that's an institutional and a political and economic problem. And this doesn't just apply at the level of operations, which is what I'm going to focus on in my comment there, that as a result of this interdependence without proper coordination, you get inefficient operation. But it's also, by the way, a very important problem when it comes to investment. Because the investments that we make in one infrastructure are in fact going to have benefit and cost streams that depend upon the investments that are made in other infrastructures, but we have no general way of taking that into account. So those are from my point of view, the three fundamental reasons why infrastructure in cities is difficult. And it's those reasons, as much as any, that I would submit lead to the problems that we were discussing a little earlier, all those problems of it not working and being threatened and so on and so forth. Now, I have only a limited amount of time to talk this morning, so I'm not going to try and tell you about everything we're doing in all these areas, but I'm going to focus on those two areas to do with the way in which services are demanded from infrastructure, the way in which infrastructure and the services it's provided are demanded by the market, and the way in which we manage the provision of those services. I'm going to leave aside the question about how we provide the infrastructure for another day. And this is the point at which I want to say a little bit about our new Urban Systems Laboratory at Imperial. It's a new venture. I'm the director of that laboratory. And we've set it up because we recognize that we have a tremendous depth and breadth of expertise in science and engineering and business and health around general portfolio of urban system challenges. I've listed some of the departments in college that have strong interests that are relevant to urban systems there. Overall, we have about 200 academic researchers working in various areas that are within the scope of urban systems at Imperial. So we think it's appropriate that we try to draw this capability together under a single banner. And that's what we're doing. We've created the USL, the Urban Systems Laboratory, as a portmanteau structure for this work. We've defined a number of broad challenges that the laboratory will address through its research programs, through its teaching programs, through its thought leadership, through its outreach and its exploitation activities. I won't talk about all of them. The one that I am most directly associated with, that reflects my own academic interests, is around sensing, modeling and simulation. So what I'm going to do, therefore, is to talk very briefly about a few of the projects we have running in that area that address, or we hope address, the two issues that I had in the little red box earlier around how you make improvements in the way in which systems are coordinated one with another, city systems are coordinated one with another, and the way in which you shape demand processes so that demand and supply are brought into better balance. So, and these are going to be drawn from the space defined by transport and energy, because that's principally where I work. Now, this is a project that addresses an issue that's in fact partly environmental as well. It's to do with air quality. Air quality in cities is bad. And one of the reasons that air quality in cities is bad is that we have episodes of traffic congestion that induce episodes of emissions that then produce elevated concentrations of various pollutants. We tend not to know very much about these episodes and the processes underlying them in real time, and I'll tell you why. The reason is that we have an air quality sensing infrastructure in London, and other cities in the UK and across Europe are just the same, that is not actually designed to make air quality better. It's designed to enforce regulation. effectively, the air quality monitoring infrastructure is an infrastructure that generates revenue for Brussels through fines imposed on cities and member states. It's not about making air quality better, it's about generating revenue. So how do you solve that? Well, you create a parallel infrastructure that enables you to monitor the relationship between air quality and mobility at the sort of granularity that's necessary in order to address the real problems, which is how do you manage the traffic dynamically, not only to reduce congestion, but also to reduce these episodes of elevated emissions leading to elevated pollution concentrations. So that's what this project did, and it was successful and deployed and is working in a number of cities, not only in London. One of the key issues for the future, if one believes the position outlined by Ian regarding climate change, one of the key challenges for the future is the decarbonisation of various of our subsystems, and in particular the decarbonisation of transport. And the decarbonisation of transport is increasingly seen as implying the electrification of transport. And this is bringing into really stark focus the need to have a way of understanding how you manage the transport system and the energy system together, not as separate subsystems. And one of the key aspects there is vehicle charging. How do you manage vehicle charging in such a way that you can optimize the use of parking infrastructure, optimize the experience for travelers, enabling them to get to the destinations, to engage in the economic activities that actually make the wealth that the city depends on, and at the same time provide a predictable and useful demand pattern for an increasingly intermittent, dependent grid. And that's what this is. This is a project that tries to use a clever form of dynamic pricing, I won't go into the details here, to create synergies between the operation of parking infrastructure, the operation of local distribution and broader energy network infrastructures. Can be done, and we're hoping to see a demo of this a little bit later this year here in London. Looking more broadly at urban systems, the question arises, as I'm sure it will at some point today in discussions, how do you make cities more energy efficient? And if you want to address that question, you have to look at the many different ways in which cities use energy, not just in transport, not just in buildings, but also in waste, in their water systems, in their green infrastructure, and so on, and so on, and so on. You have to have a way of looking at the totality of energy use in cities, and then using that understanding of the totality of energy use in cities to begin the process of design and redesign, either when you have the opportunity in a greenfield context, or more likely and more commonly, incrementally, in an existing rich and complex and constrained built environment. And that's what this project was about. It was about creating a modeling system that enables us to understand energy use in its total in a city, and then use that understanding as a basis for design, either greenfield or incremental brownfield. And again, we can say more about that later if you're interested. A big issue around many discussions on cities at the moment is digital. And the view, or not part of this standard canonical view that's emerging at the moment is that salvation lies in digital. And this may well be true to some degree, but we haven't quite got there yet. We've got lots of nice little apps that help us to do things, but they don't by themselves make the buses arrive on time. They may tell you exactly how late they are, but they don't make them arrive on time. So my feeling is that we need to make a step change in how we think about digital in relation to cities. And this was one of a series of projects that we have that's trying to do that. That's trying to take the idea of being able to look at cities not just as a series of disconnected subsystems, but as Ian was mentioning earlier, a system of systems, a system of connected and interconnected subsystems, reflecting that in the way that we harvest data from the many different subsystems that operate in an urban area and provision that data to application developers and innovators in a way that enables them to create the next generation of applications that are really going to be game changers, that are really going to shift the balance in desirable directions. And that's what this project is about. Okay, so I could go on with lots of chatter about academic stuff, but I won't. I want to leave you with some observations and one or two questions. It seems to me that the sort of problems that we've been discussing around urban systems have the character of what in the academic literature is called wicked and messy problems. Churchman was the first to come up with this concept, and I think it's an incredibly insightful one, because he observed that there's a set of problems in the world that everyone knows, but no one can really define fully. That once you try to define it, you find that it mutates, it metastasizes into something else. And that the more you dig into problems, the more interconnected one problem seems to another problem. And that all of the problems together have a highly politicized nature. And many, and I would suggest actually most of the problems that are typically part of that standard canonical description of urban challenges have this wicked and messy character, have these four characteristics. Now, if that's the case, I think we should be very, very, very modest in the extent to which we claim that anything that we do can actually solve any of these problems. I think we've got to try and improve our lot and the lot of our fellow man and the performance of our cities. But let's be a little humble about the claims we make to solve things. And I think we need also to be aware that today's solutions can become tomorrow's problems. I'm now quite old, so one of the few benefits of being quite old is that you have memories of your own and other people's mistakes. And one of the most powerful memories, one of the most powerful general images one has is of oneself and one's colleagues and the political and business leaders that one has known through one's life, looking down at some mess and thinking, Christ, I didn't intend it to be like that. That wasn't how it was supposed to be. Of course, it wasn't how it was supposed to be. But it's by no means an accident that is a repeated experience that we all have, and that the older we get, the more experience we have of that. So one particular aspect of that, which I'll leave you on this morning, is the risks embedded in the drive to coordinate. And we've already touched on that in some of the earlier discussion. The more we interconnect, the more we try to actively manage those boundaries between different systems, the more we try to exploit the last iota of efficiency that exists on the interface, arguably, the more critical our systems become, the closer we push our systems to critical states, and the more catastrophic the failures may be when they arise. also, the more difficult it is to understand what's going on. And I think one of the big challenges that we have to face in the future is living in systems which will increasingly no longer be fully understood. We already have that in the financial sector, and we saw where that got us. We're heading towards that in city infrastructure and services. How do we prevent the analog of 2008 occurring in our space at some point in the future? Okay, thank you very much. I'm done.
Thank you, John, very much for that. Remember to keep your questions in mind. We'll have questions at the end in a 20-minute session after the three speakers. Our next speaker is Sue Illman. Sue is Managing Director of Illman Young, and as President of the Landscape Institute, Sue championed the use of green infrastructure in flood prevention and campaigned for a coordinated response from government towards the threat of floods, raising awareness of the issue among the wider public. And this activity complemented the Institute's longer-term work on sustainable drainage, water management, and sensitive urban design. So, Sue, thank you.
Okay, well, I'm not going to apologise for what's actually going to be a bit of a rant today. I'll just stir you all up and make sure you don't fall asleep. So today I'm talking about infrastructure, but infrastructure that at present hasn't made it to the National Infrastructure Agenda. Green infrastructure, or GI, and water. Together, the blue and green parts of our environment, the rivers, lakes, fields, woods, parks, gardens and street trees that comprise over 93% of our country. So, despite their extent, are green infrastructure and water what we might call Cinderella subjects? Pretty things, never quite out of sight, but often out of mind. Our servants, exploited to provide what we need, when we want it. They're important to us, but we don't want to acknowledge it, as our immediate needs, the good life, is much too important for us to be overly bothered. That is until the magic stops, and it all goes wrong. When urban pollution and heat make us ill, and floods destroy our homes, businesses and lives. And this conference perhaps illustrates the point, our theme. How can we make cities smarter, more sustainable and resilient? Well, we can't, unless we understand how to work with and respect the natural environment to provide the things we need. Clean air and water, food, safe, resilient, healthy, beautiful places where we can live, work and bring up our families. So why is it important? What I would like to explore is how we have understood the problems of modern living, but failed to tackle them in a meaningful way, and how we could start to solve them if we genuinely wanted to. Over the last 5 years and more, there have been successive reports to and on behalf of government that have ably analysed the problems we face beyond the known issues of population growth and climate change. In 2011, the National Natural Environment White Paper, an ambitious plan for the UK, and an equally ambitious role for government in both the European and international arena to lead and put nature and the green economy at the heart of economic growth, and the government's stated intention to leave the natural environment in a better condition after 5 years than they inherited. Again in 2011, Biodiversity 2020, another ambitious strategy for biodiversity in England, building on the Natural Environment White Paper and the UK NEA at a local scale, in recognition of the value of the natural environment to the economy and the well-being of society. However, reviewing its achievements in the 2013 State of Nature report, a far from glowing picture emerged. The Natural Capital Committee was set up to report on the condition of the country's natural assets, delivered through 3 separate reports, outlining huge concerns and the potential damage to the economy if natural resources continue to be ignored. On the waterfront, the trail goes back even further. Water quality problems and the need for change was enshrined in the Water Framework Directive in 2000, requiring us to address the problems in both our fresh and marine water environment for its threat to the supporting ecosystems, with consequential impacts for us all. The flooding foresight reports were started in 2002 and have been reviewed twice, setting out to use science to assist government in good policy making regarding the risks of flooding and coastal erosion over the next 100 years. Their latest update records a situation that hasn't improved, with recent policy not supported by the concerns of science. 2011 Water White Paper addressed water supply and quality and acknowledged the increasing problems of demand for water for all users in the face of climate change and the impacts on the water environment through over-abstraction and diffuse pollution. 2007 saw the floods, and the analysis of how flooding could be avoided in future in the 2008 Pitt Review, leading to the Flood and Water Management Act 2010 as a response to Sir Michael Pitt's recommendations, but with sustainable drainage only partially implemented and then recently essentially abandoned with the intervention of DCLG. And finally, more recently in 2015, the All-Party Parliamentary Group report Living with Water, which documented with astonishment the complex, disconnected nature of our water management systems, the lack of joined-up ownerships, responsibility, thinking and planning, making clear recommendations for change. So we quite clearly know where we stand, as none of these problems have gone away. In fact, they're worse. But where has time taken us since all those reports were written? To quite a strange but interesting place. In terms of leadership in tackling all the problems identified, we've actually seen very little. We move forwards, sideways and back, with the reports on the natural environment mixed and ultimately worrying, whether it's dying bee populations threatening food production, fish dying from water pollution or tree disease. Similarly, the problems of flooding have not been addressed in the least, with government holding its breath every time it rains for more than 2 to 3 days in case it floods somewhere again. We all appreciate the problems and the need of building a strong economy, but every single government report or committee recommendation stresses how working smartly with the natural environment can save us money in very large amounts. That puts a very different complexion on the mantra of "it's the economy, stupid," because the cost to the economy of not dealing with it is huge. The value of pollination to the food industry is estimated at £440 million per annum, 13% of its value, and that service is irreplaceable. Drought conditions reduce food production, increase its cost, and make us ever more reliant on expensive imports. Lack of water may limit economic growth through manufacture. Conversely, 5.2 million homes are currently at risk in flooding. That's 1 in 6. The cost of flood damage each year is estimated at £1.1 billion, and the annual cost of maintaining existing flood defences will rise to £1 billion by 2035. And then there's just the cost to the economy in terms of lost business time, lost production, and the direct cost of infrastructure reinstatement when our railways, roads, power stations and water treatment plants are flooded, let alone our houses. The cost to employers and the NHS from illness due to urban overheating, air pollution and mental health problems, let alone the problems of obesity and social unrest. And the practical and emotional cost to us all, having to address these problems as part of our daily life, and the cost to future generations in terms of the legacy we leave them, both in their own health and the cost to them of dealing with the damage we cause. It is indeed the economy, stupid. One of our problems is that today we often look for the big solution and the complex engineered approach as technology is smart and what our cities need. But I'd like to give you a simple example of how at a small scale we can get the landscape to work hard through the value of tree planting in an urban area in solving a complex range of problems. My trees will lead to improvements in the urban heat island effect, airborne pollution and carbon sequestration, with the consequent benefits to health and well-being. We know that fewer children suffer from asthma when they live next to trees. Trees take up water in suds features, with water passing through the soil providing improvements to water quality as well as infiltration to recharge aquifers, and surface water attenuation to prevent flooding. People are encouraged to sit, cycle or walk along well-designed pleasant streets, with trees providing both recreational opportunities and more health benefits. We know that patients in hospitals need fewer painkillers and recover quicker if their outlook is into a green space or of trees. The trees are host to a range of wildlife, from invertebrates to birds, not forgetting the children who play in them. Economically, trees in streets increase property values and crime levels reduce in areas with green infrastructure. That is a comprehensive result for quite a simple investment and is an easy way to make our streets more sustainable and pleasant places to live. But we also need to address the technical solutions, as one of the most interesting areas for me is that interface in our towns and cities of the natural environment and engineering, what I like to call a civil partnership. We need our landscapes to work hard, often in polluted city soils or almost no soils at all, greening walls, roofs and buildings, attenuating surface water, providing food, in places and ways that nature never intended, but all perfectly possible and deliverable with the right understanding of how bioengineering can work. At the same time, water-sensitive urban design promotes closing the water cycle as far as possible, bringing together the complete management and reuse of all water, potable, grey and black, in both our buildings and as an intrinsic part of the design of the urban fabric, providing better spaces and places, maximising water economy and minimising potable water use. But getting our landscapes and green infrastructure to work hard isn't necessarily easy these days, as we must positively enable that to happen. And over the last few years, we've seen a gradual and continual chipping away of the mechanisms that support my civil partnership. The loss of the bigger picture through regional planning, a redefinition of sustainable development through the NPPF, a narrow focus on numbers of homes at the expense of quality, the abolition of cave space, a key advocate for green infrastructure to government, and the emasculation of agencies such as Natural England. This is compounded by the loss of skills within the public sector, whose roles included that of being the intelligent client, alongside the expectation that local authorities struggling to provide essential local services can take the lead in guiding and determining complex planning issues involving technical problems of sustainability, water management, pollution and GI. The void caused by this loss has often been filled by those of us in the professions filling that gap from the national strategic level down. And this has enabled the government over the last 5 years to actually deliver a strange version of their forgotten mantra for a better society, localism. A method of encouraging us all to take responsibility for doing all the things government doesn't want to do and doesn't want to pay for. And we've signed up for it in droves, for LEPs and bids, for local nature partnerships, working nature improvement areas, partnering in the Green Infrastructure Partnership, producing biodiversity action plans and promoting SUDs, tree planting and healthy living. The list of specialist interests and environmental groups has mushroomed exponentially. We go to endless round tables, agree how good it is to collaborate, produce ever more interdisciplinary guidance documents, and cudgel our brains with the demand for innovative funding solutions that will be the magic bullet and solve all our problems. That can't be bad, surely. The effect of all those departmental reports and documents alongside the NPPF has indeed led us all to the unitary district, borough or city level towards a more sustainable and environmentally based approach to the way we plan, design and build our cities. We support the vision that we should plan and manage our natural assets better because we need to work with them to enable them to work with us. Our problem is twofold. That vision is widely varied across the country and by being local is consequently not properly coordinated and therefore not comprehensive. Some authorities are better funded and resourced and will be able to secure better outcomes than others, leading to greater imbalance in society. Action at a national level is therefore essential because some things are of strategic importance, and unless there is a simple and appropriate legislation or guidance, then all those excellent local plans and initiatives can never be as effective as they need to be. We see this already in Scotland and Wales, where their devolved governments are taking their own view on matters such as compulsory implementation of sustainable drainage or requiring higher standards of performance, setting the framework for effective local delivery. They believe the economic arguments and are delivering better policy and lives as a consequence. So why can't we? We're potentially helped in this by both the Natural Capital Committee report and the APPG reports. Their proposals include that the National Infrastructure Plan should incorporate natural capital into each of the main infrastructure sectors, and an investment programme for natural capital should also explicitly feature in the National Infrastructure Plan. Single departmental planning and land use. We know departmental mergers are already being contemplated. And that links with the APPG recommendations for a strategic review of land use, placing water and climate change alongside a range of other emerging priorities for a multifunctional landscape. It also calls for the specific ministerial responsibility for water at cabinet level, and for water and green infrastructure to be considered beyond one government term as other infrastructures are. We also need to promote a proper uptake of sustainable drainage, with adoption issues being resolved for all new development, and we need to ensure long-term management and funding for the maintenance of SUDs, critical if this form of green infrastructure is not to fail as part of our drainage infrastructure. And we need a comprehensive programme of retrofitting to build flood resilience. Government support can also help deliver the bottom-up approach. We've seen it in America, in Portland, where they disconnected 56,000 downpipes and connected them to SUDs, reducing both their pollution problems and flooding and improving their green infrastructure. Philadelphia and New York are doing it their own way, committing large sums of money to deliver flood resilience through GI. In each case, $25 billion over 20 to 25 years. Money only committed because its economic value has been established. So whilst I'm encouraged to see detailed surface water management plans being developed in cities from Glasgow to London, the budgets available are derisory by comparison, with commitments of maybe £1 million per annum in some of the largest cities. But at least it's a start, as with the right vision, then we can deliver resilience incrementally and locally, stimulating growth and employment in the way that was envisaged in the Natural Environment White Paper. So overall, how are we going to deliver? It's clearly very interesting politically at the moment, as we see a real lack of commitment to most environmental matters by the two main parties. The Lib Dems have actually fully engaged with the issue of natural capital. But will a coalition help? What are considered lesser issues have a habit of getting lost in the cut and thrust of political negotiations. And indeed, most of what I've talked about will require cross-party support, that very difficult animal to harness. We hear of potential government departmental mergers which may assist in delivering a coherent view once the dust settles. What is clear is we need a strong vision with simple solutions. We need to properly understand and value the contribution the environment can make, and we genuinely need to make a commitment to change, and goodness me, we need leadership. We then need a legislative framework that makes sure it will happen, with green infrastructure part of the National Infrastructure Plan. And we must empower and require public bodies and private organisations to make change, and value the expertise of the professionals in our national agency to give informed advice. We will then have 5 years to take stock and create a new direction so that we can deliver cities that are smarter, more sustainable and resilient. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sue. That was very interesting. Enjoyed your civil partnership definition and just below 20 minutes on time, so that's brilliant. Thank you. Our final speaker before we come to time of questions is Joe Baker. Joe is Development Director for Urbanisation at Mott MacDonald. His background is in transport planning, and Joe specialises very much in the interaction of transport and urban society. So, Joe, thank you.
Let's see if this is... Yes. Good morning, everybody. So I got up early. I was very excited. Some of the points John was making I would agree very strongly with, and hopefully feed into some of the things I was going to say later on. What I thought I'd talk about was what I've called perhaps the urban resilience life cycle in terms of the way that we might deal with some of the challenges to urban areas. And again, I hadn't thought of the name of these, but I think Wicked and Messy is an excellent name. I was going to talk about them as the bad guys, but I would agree entirely. There are a lot of different challenges that we face in urban areas. Some of them we're very aware of, particularly around weather, climate change, flooding, terrorism, unfortunately, increasingly, but also other things like disease. And until terrorism kicked in, we were very worried about things like SARS. Then we suddenly forgot about that. There's things like that still lurking out there, but also even special events. And I'll come back later on things like the Olympic Games, which, if not managed correctly, can still have a significant impact on our urban areas. And also seismic conditions as well. There's just been another volcano erupting in Chile. No one was expecting it. Apparently significant damage done. And we are not good at remembering that these things happen. So lots of wicked, messy challenges out there. Lots of ways in which we can deal with them. And again, I'd agree with John that there are different ways we should deal with them. People talk about resilience, they talk about adaptation. And I've seen some definitions which suggest that resilience is a good thing because you're being proactive, you're dealing with a problem. Adaptation is somehow succumbing, failing to address the thing. And I think what I'd like to perhaps talk about in the next 20 minutes is really there are different ways in which we can deal with these problems. They cost different amounts, the benefits are different, and perhaps what's really important is that we think what is the most appropriate way of dealing with different problems. I've come up with perhaps 6 different stages of what I'd call the urban resilience cycle in the ways in which we might deal with some of these. And what I'll take you through in turn is each of those. So just to start on prevention, my colleague Ian talked earlier about climate change. Many of us are very, very aware of issues around climate change, the links to carbon. We all think automatically of the things we could do. That's a nice green bicycle taxi in Copenhagen. There are many other things. It's very important we really understand the issue and think sensibly what are the best ways to deal with the challenge. Something we've engaged with in the last few months is the DEC Global Calculator, which is perhaps not a finished tool, but it's a starting point as a tool to look at the different drivers or levers, as DEC call them, which influence carbon increases, and trying to work out how to restrict temperature growths to 2 degrees centigrade by 2050. That looks across a wide range of sectors, and having engaged with this, and the tool is available as a free download, so I'd urge other people to go on and find it and learn for yourselves perhaps how we as professionals can engage with this topic. We found some very, very interesting outcomes in terms of things which one would expect would have a major impact and didn't. The other one, which has perhaps lost me a few friends, is we found a really huge impact was related to diet and particularly agricultural production. And a lot of this links into things like water and other things. Putting land over to production of meat is not efficient in terms of water, in terms of chemicals, and actually a plant-based diet helps deal significantly and was one of the most powerful levers in terms of dealing with climate change. I've raised that at a couple of very specifically environmental events, and even now I've had some very, very frosty glances put back at me, but I'm a vegetarian, I have no worries with this at all. But it does tell you quite an interesting story, and I think what's really important is it's fact-based rather than our opinion-based. There are lots of nice things we can do to save the environment. We need to find the ones that really are actually going to help us do so. Other things, lots of other wicked, messy things around, many types of civil unrest. This is just an example of litter in the street Equally, I could have shown the fuel protests that we saw 15 years ago. All these things not only can stop cities functioning effectively, but they damage quality of life. And when we look at some of the things like terrorism and unrest, a lot of those originate because quality of life is threatened, communities are not happy, and that has a big knock-on impact as to the way our cities function. So there's a lot of issues there around governance and the way that if we have effective governance in our cities, again, we prevent some of these other problems happening because we have a stable and more happy society. If you think about it even more rationally, where do we put our cities? Floodplains is a classic example in the UK where people site things in bad places. This is Pompeii at the foot of Vesuvius. People are still building. People in many worlds are aware there is a very strong risk of another eruption in Vesuvius, but they're still building. They're putting up businesses, houses. There could be some sort of eruption any time. There are about 10 million people in the vicinity, and there are threats potentially even to a city like Naples. And you could look again at California, where not only you have the risk of seismic activity, you've also got a major drought at the moment as well. So you've got no water, risk of seismic activity, but still development goes on. So we can do an awful lot to help ourselves just thinking how we plan our cities before we worry about resilience of them. The other point I'd make around that is around systemic failure. And when disasters do strike, something we're aware of in Mott MacDonald, because one of our colleagues was involved with the aftermath, was the Clapham rail disaster. It's not a coincidence things happen. It's not usually one bit of bad luck. It's a combination, often a failure of leadership, a failure of communication, perhaps the way that quality was assured, staff competency, supervision. You put all those things together, and typically, most times, we get away with it. And the times things fail are where there is a systematic failure right the way across a number of different factors, and all those elements conspire against us. Many other disasters that have happened have had similar coincidences, systemic failures, call them what you will, and the result is without thinking through the management of our urban areas that we can hit those problems. In terms of how we perhaps divert impacts of things. Again, the Olympic Games might seem a very strange thing to talk about. Actually, an awful lot of really great work was done on the Olympic Games to make sure that it didn't have a negative impact on London's businesses. The map in the bottom left was plotting out congestion at all the tube stations in order to be able to advise people when and where to travel, looking in detail at how the Olympics would actually function, making use then of social media to disseminate that information, but really to make sure that the economy of the city was not damaged by the impact of the Games. Another form of diversion, which we're all aware of, is when we have the tragic aftermath of major flooding. It's very easy to come along and put in further defences to deal with flooding locally. Water has to go somewhere, and if you're in a river, it's great if you can find an area to divert floodwaters to, but you still do need to remember about what happens upstream and downstream of potential flood risk areas, and not assume that just by protecting the thing that has flooded now, you're not perhaps causing equal problems downstream later on. So there's a slight problem with the projector here. So what I was going to talk about here was the defence of urban areas. In the Netherlands, they're absolutely adept at it. As many of us know, an awful lot of the Netherlands is below sea level. You can put up major dikes and dams to prevent your territory. That, of course, is a very costly approach to take. In the Netherlands, it's served them well for many years. Whether all that infrastructure will function as sea levels continue to rise is perhaps another matter. We've all seen, again, the impact of the tragic tsunamis that have hit on a number of occasions, and ultimately, whatever defences you put away are at risk still of being washed away. So while we can put these expensive defences in, they may not give us the long-term solutions that we're really seeking. Just to give you a few examples, somewhere like Venice, perhaps you can protect, it's in a lagoon. There are areas like that where you can put up, as we've got in London, the Thames Barrier, but even such defences won't last forever. The flip side, it's like Mont Saint-Michel out in the peninsula, sticking into the sea, that had a high water event recently and lost its causeway. It was anticipated that would happen. I think it was actually a bit of a tourist attraction there. But in other areas, as sea levels rise, we will find territory that simply can't be protected because of the geography of the space it's in. So we then move into perhaps the adaptation side of it, looking at mitigation. This is a floating house perhaps a slightly tongue-in-cheek use of a picture of one, but actually quite seriously in the Netherlands, floating houses are being looked at as a serious solution. People know floods will potentially happen again, and having houses that can, in a structured and managed way, float is perhaps a realistic way of accepting that these things will happen. Similarly about properties where the lower areas are able to withstand a degree of flooding, can be hosed out again, reused again, rather than the disastrous impacts that we've had where people have buckled parquet floors and all sorts of things that simply will not work in a flood zone. Tower of Pisa, thanks to our colleagues at Imperial College, is now stabilised, but it managed to stay sloping for many hundreds of years. And again, sometimes we just have to accept that we mitigate the impacts, accept something will not be quite perfect. Trying to protect and completely deal with the way the elements conspire against us is simply not going to be a viable solution forever. Then reinforcement, which is an area I think my background also being transport planning I'm particularly interested in. We often have single points of failure in our networks. This is the road going into Gibraltar. It's crossed by an airstrip, which in itself is a slightly bizarre situation, but it does leave a territory which doesn't have a great relationship with its only neighbour, very vulnerable in terms of surface access. And this whole issue about single access points is hugely damning to economies. Coming closer to home, people will be aware of the damage at Dawlish that happened recently. That's happened many times over the last 100 years. That's not a one-off occurrence, losing a major rail line with huge economic impacts on the towns and cities in Cornwall, which most of us are aware is actually quite a deprived area despite its very attractive surroundings. So it then brings us into the question, if we want to reinforce the network and find potentially a second rail corridor in, how we can finance that. And I think most interestingly, how we can create the business case for doing so, because these things are expensive. And one of the areas which I think is perhaps not totally well understood yet, and particularly as things like climate incidents become more and more frequent, is how we can actually quantify the potential costs of these things happening more often and the benefits of getting a more resilient infrastructure in place, because we've actually got a degree of redundancy through reinforcing the network. So I don't think I've got all the answers on that yet, but I think it is an area which increasingly we are going to have to address because of the really serious impacts that has on the economies downstream of things like that. One solution that I think is quite an interesting one from Malaysia, this is a road tunnel, but it's one that has the ability to double as a stormwater drain in instance where there's very high levels of rain, which in Malaysia is kind of 4 o'clock every afternoon, really. I don't think it always floods that badly every time. But what's really important is you can have flood capacity at the bottom, but you can actually go up further. You can close the road to traffic. So when there are particularly serious incidents, you can make dual use of the same infrastructure. And again, smart engineering solutions like that have to be the way forward, given that we deal with limited resources and increased frequency of challenges to the ways that our cities function. Just as another example, this one's actually in Greece, where some of the many roads that the EU enthusiastically funded are now beginning to sadly disintegrate. And again, it does raise the question, this isn't in a city, this connects cities. And it again raises this really big question as to who pays for these infrastructure in probably fairly deprived rural community, perhaps a national authority that's not incentivised to look out at it. But there will be cities at each end of this road whose economies will be struggling because of the loss of infrastructure that's gradually being washed away, worn away. If you go further up and down this road, you'll find bits of it almost covered by rocks that have fallen down by the mountains. Again, there's no operating infrastructure in place to clear that as well. So there's a big question again about who actually pays for some of these. So the final bit I was going to come on to is managing problems. Sometimes we really can't deal with what's thrown at us, and disasters will hit. Seismic eruptions being a classic example of that. And at that point, the ability to have good information, to my mind, is critical so that we can deal with these things. That can be challenging. Something I've observed, particularly as a regular rail user, is when two things go wrong at once, well-laid contingency plans tend to fail because the interaction of two different unforeseen events is very, very hard to manage. But we do increasingly have the power to capture information and to deal with it quickly, typically using things like GIS systems with fairly quick responses and the ability certainly to store a range of contingency plans in place. This one's just an example. I'm looking at the transport system. Increasingly, as we develop building information management for our buildings, we can look towards the day when we actually link models of buildings and structures to the Internet of Things, so we have better information coming from all aspects of our city infrastructure, the ability to detect problems as they occur and to deal with them remotely rather than being dependent on human interaction. We're not going to get to, I think, the full operational BIM for some time, but that has to be the way we look forward, that we see our cities as being better instrumented and better able to deal with problems. And that's the point where I think the digital solutions aren't just about telling us there are problems. I think they are ways that we can actually start to improve our city infrastructure. We're perhaps not there yet, but it's something to look forward to. Other examples, certainly this is very applicable in the water sector, where better monitoring of things like boreholes, flood risk, also flows, where perhaps it detects blockages in the systems, can certainly be managed, and GIS is a tool which really lends itself to that. And something else, which this is a bit of a plug for something that's nothing to do with us, but one of my colleagues is involved with, Map Action is a charity that supports disaster relief globally. When a problem occurs, GIS specialists, many from this country, are committed to providing immediate support, because what's been discovered is when you're dealing with the aftermath of something like a tsunami, there often is very, very poor data, and the teams that are dropped in have very, very little in the way of supporting information and infrastructure. And so having a quick team in place to develop mapping and information is a really powerful way of dealing with that. So again, it's something as professionals, hopefully we can contribute to, or colleagues who have that type of skill base are in a position to contribute to. If you've got any CSR funds, again, I think it's a very worthy cause, which as professionals we can really perhaps understand. So just a few conclusions I'd want to draw. I'd echo some of the points earlier. I think city resilience can be approached in many ways, and big, hard infrastructure, sometimes the solution, it's often not the solution. There are lots of different things we ought to be thinking about doing. We must think about risk assessment, particularly at the planning stages, to really preempt problems. There's really no excuse for bad design, but we do see lots of bizarre decisions made, as commented earlier, about the amount of housing that's in flood risk areas, but we're still building houses in really unsuitable areas. I would reiterate the point that many disasters do result from systemic failure, and that better management of such issues will help. I think we need to improve the way we look at cost-benefit analysis of alternative solutions. Typically, as I'm a transport planner, we look at cost-benefit analysis based on the steady state where infrastructure is in place. We haven't really moved to a point of thinking about the what-ifs in terms of if you lose a major rail link or a major road link. Stakeholder engagement is often really critical to successful implementation of change. A lot of these issues are very, very emotive, particularly ones around things like flood risk. The impacts are not always easy for people to deal with. And indeed, as I said earlier, the idea that perhaps we need to consume less meat and more vegetarian food is one that stakeholders aren't particularly happy with. But we do need to think very seriously about in terms of the future. And finally, and this afternoon's session I know is heading into the territory around financing, we need to think about how we capture the value from enhanced resilience. We need to draw down investment from the people who really benefit, which may not be the people responsible for that bit of infrastructure. And I'd sort of echo the point John was making. We've got a very uncoordinated infrastructure system. So there are things like tax increment financing, which may be mechanisms whereby the businesses in cities that benefit from having infrastructure in place are better encouraged to contribute to that infrastructure. So just final couple of images to think about. This is one example, unabashed holiday snap. Fateh Sikri was the capital of the Mughal Empire about 500 years ago. It was abandoned after 15 years because it had no water. So really stupid planning decisions were being made then, but they're still being made now. And then finally, just as a gentle observation, these slides came from my colleagues in Brazil. There are lots and lots of cities around the world where what we think about as a disaster is the normal state. So thinking globally as well as just thinking about ourselves in the UK, a lot of these problems are not just one-off problems, they are everyday state. So as professionals, I think we can all play quite a big role in trying to address those. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Joe, very much indeed. If our three speakers would join me at the front, we've got a few minutes now for questions. Thank you to all three for keeping very well to time. We're pretty much on track. So who would like to be the first to pose a question on our sessions this morning? At the back, yes. Yes, is that, yeah.
Follow up on your Ross on UHB. Perhaps directing it more to Sue, but also to the others. I recognise the challenges you've given in terms of green infrastructure, sustainable drainage, and how we need to bring the whole of that together and create multifunctional places, and the fact that they provide multiple benefits for economy, environment, and things like flood management. Having said that, and having provided a lot of data available of research that shows very clearly the multiple benefits of sustainable drainage for all of this, how do we start to really make the government go from a point of we recognize that's true to actually showing leadership in coming up with policies, as you say, it needs to happen, which allows that to happen? So we don't get to the situation with SODS where SODS was going to deal with multiple benefits. Now, last minute, is only dealing with water management, and water quality, environmental quality, habitat quality were all thrown out at the last minute. What do you think we need to do more to actually make this happen?
So is that one for you?
Yeah, that really is the $64,000 question, absolutely. It may depend in part on the complexion of the government that comes in, because I think that there may be different approaches depending on where that is. Clearly the Floods and Water Management Act came in, or its roots were as part of the Labour government, and I think in part that's what, and the situation we're in, that's where we are today. So I think there will be different responses. When we saw the greatest movement recently was in February last year, when we had all the disastrous flooding down in Somerset and indeed elsewhere, although that got the majority of the publicity. So I think, unfortunately, we seem to get change when we get disasters happening, and that's why I said I think the government has absolutely had its fingers crossed that we wouldn't have another flood and that we wouldn't have another one this spring, because that would have been disastrous for the Conservatives. So I think there may be an element of there having to be, unfortunately, some disasters to give us some stimulation. We are seeing action on the ground. The problem is that it's very slow and it's very small. I'm involved in surface water management plans in Glasgow. I know there's good work being done in London at the moment in developing a plan. So we are getting grassroots, but that's not attracting the level of funding that we need. I think we also have to, and I'm absolutely with you on all the multiple benefits, we need engineering and we need green infrastructure, and we absolutely need them to work together. I do think that when we're looking at a lot of flood alleviation and resilience schemes, we need to look at our optioneering much more closely, because we do see that schemes are not being taken forward because of the cost when they're only looked at on an engineering basis, and you're nodding, so you agree with me. That sometimes if you're a bit more creative in your optioneering and you look at how you can mix these things together, you can get so much better value for money, and that makes schemes much more affordable. I think we have to be very, very clever indeed in what we do it. The APPG report, that is, it came out at a time just when the changing, build up to the election was happening. It hasn't really gone anywhere. That report is going to be taken forward, and there now is a new select committee on the built environment, and that's also an opportunity to ask them to look at the problem of integrated water management and how it affects cities. So I think there's lots of little avenues. I mean, clearly with the Lib Dems and their great approach, if we had a majority government by then, well, maybe we would see something, but that really is fantasy land. So let's stick with reality. So lots of small changes, and I think keep pushing as much as we can.
Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I would add is government is swayed by business at the moment, and decisions will be based on business cases, and so monetisation of the benefits is going to be absolutely critical, and the more that we can put into the monetised box rather than the qualitative box, the better. We've seen a lot around that. When I started doing transport appraisals 25 years ago, we could monetise the travel time savings, and everything else was put in the rather green, wishy-washy qualitative box. And over the last 20 years, more and more has become monetised, and that means business cases are simply better because social benefits, environmental benefits are increasingly being quantified and becoming hard, and that helps get perhaps the more logical decisions, more rational decisions made. So that's something we can all perhaps help do.
Anybody else have a question? Yes, sir. Yeah.
David Arkell from Cambridge. With arguably an increasingly unintelligent public sector client, does the panel think that actually codes of professional practice should be enhanced, and if so, how could we do that? Because I deal with sustainable built environment professionals, but they're made up of architects, engineers, and health professionals and others. So I'm really concerned that the panel didn't really address that issue, even though it's maybe a small issue.
Yeah, I'll have a stab at that. I think it's a reasonable point, and certainly I agree with the premise of your question. The question that follows is who writes the codes? It's the Friedman question, where do we find the paragons imbued with sufficient knowledge and insight, etc.? And they're few and far between. And what's the opportunity cost associated with developing such mechanisms, and what's the real cost associated with enforcing such mechanisms? It could turn into yet another ratchet of the bureaucratic spiral. And I think one needs to balance the potential benefits that one would see from systematizing that aspect of practice with the real risks that one creates yet more stultifying bureaucracy in an environment where there is already more than enough stultifying bureaucracy. I don't know the answer, but I think that's the nature of the trade-off.
I mean, I totally share your concerns about the public sector. Most of my work has been work done for cities, and as I've said to people in a number of places, these people are my friends, and many of them have gone, and I really regret the loss of expertise. What's happened within Mott MacDonald is we recognise climate resilience is a growing concern, and we certainly see that this is something we have to, as professionals, take responsibility for, if nothing else, because of the risk that we could be deemed negligent in due course if we've not taken those issues into account in the designs that we produce. So that's something we're looking at very, very seriously as a company, encouraging our clients to do so because we think it's important, and also making sure we're being proactive about, as I say, purely pragmatically as well, because we think this could be a major negligence issue 20, 30 years downstream.
A few things. I mean, there's a move towards a common code of conduct for professional institutions, so there's potentially a framework there, but that doesn't solve the problem on the ground. I think at a practical level, we have to look at the way we carry out our CPD between public and private sector and be much more proactive at sharing knowledge and knowledge exchange and making effective information available. So I think we can own the problem ourselves and do what we can. I go and do CPD sessions for local authorities, particularly around water, and just try to open them to the thinking that's current. So I think we have to, we're back to the bottom-up approach of grassroots doing it.
Yes, sir, at the back, yeah.
Back to this business of responsibility that protection every option's taken. On behalf of the professions that create our cities and continue to work and develop our cities, do you think it's time that all the professional institutes are embedded in the very point you just raised, which is professional ethics and the possibility that it's about due diligence for the future, that within our code of ethics and the professions we should start strongly embedding the responsibilities of all climate?
I suppose, sorry, hedging my bets, probably. It's the way that the professional institutes influence what's done isn't something perhaps I'm terribly confident as to whether that happens. I think, probably back to my previous question actually about green infrastructure, It's often economic drivers are important, and we all need to see that this is not just about what's nice, it's not just about policy. People need to see that as a developer, if you develop something that's not resilient, you're going to lose your money because it's going to get flooded. Something bad, something wicked and messy is going to happen to it. If you're a consultant designing something or a contractor building something and it goes wrong and you haven't taken that into account, it's not about your ethical code of conduct. It's a purely economical thing. And I think there's nothing that's going to drive people's behaviours more than thinking they could lose their shirt if they don't actually proceed in the right way. So the ethics is great. As I say, I've never had the experience of trying to push something ethical through one of the professional institutes, so I have no idea how easy or how effective that is. But I know that by making people aware that there's serious risk out there, that will drive behaviours, because if people think they'll lose money, they really will change the way that they respond. I do think that that's a good way of focusing the mind, to say the least. As Sue said, it's about the economy, stupid, and often that is actually what really drives people.
I think there's a little bit in terms of, I mean, as you know, George, the Edge Commission did a report on the future of professionalism, and at the moment, professional institutions are extremely varied in what they actually include in their codes of conduct. I mean, some stick much more to the sort of functional things, and others do embrace things like a responsibility towards trying to improve issues in terms of sustainability and climate change. Trying to find a common basis for that, I think, would be difficult, but is admirable. But absolutely, the problem is we do need people to understand where the problems are and that it will cost them money. But we've got to remember that, when we sit here in London and we're looking at big development, and probably teams and clients who are knowledgeable and understand these issues on a day-to-day basis, actually the majority of development, I mean, it's the same with housing. 50% of housing built in this country is built by small local builders, and they don't have that expertise and knowledge to actually address the issues that we need them to address. So yes, they might get it in their pockets, but I think they're walking blindly into the problem. And I really don't know how we tackle that problem of how we look at development throughout the country and enable people to make the right choices if they don't have at their fingertips the information that they need to allow them to make those right choices. So I think it is a really difficult problem.
I would just add, and Sue alluded to this earlier, if we had a regional spatial strategy which set out a clear programme and policy for house building, we'd be less likely to have those problems. We don't have regional spatial strategies anymore.
I'd just add one comment to my colleagues, and that is that I'm perhaps a little less comfortable than they or you are with the idea of elevating a belief to an ethical principle. Because it seems to me that once you anoint something ethical, what you're essentially saying is, I don't want to hear any criticism. This must be true by decree. And there are very few things in the world that have that confidence in their truth status. And climate change is one of them. The question is what we decide is ethical. Yeah. Quite. What does the ethical principle that says we have a responsibility to society actually mean? Well, I mean, there's two issues here. There's the desirability or otherwise of having ethical guidelines as a profession, whatever the profession might be, number one. And then there's number two, which is which aspects of practice get elevated to that status. And I don't have a problem with certain aspects of practice being regarded as ethically correct. For example, complying with the law. I do have a problem with elevating to the status of an ethical principle an element of belief around which there is still significant scientific debate and notwithstanding what Ian said earlier, and notwithstanding what no doubt you believe, dispute. I think it is not correct to elevate anything to do with climate to that status. It's a hypothesis. It's not a truth. And like all hypotheses, it could be proven by future to be wrong. That's not the right basis on which to elevate anything to ethical status, in my view.
Time for one last quick question. I think you're edging to talk there.
I'll follow up from that interesting comments at the end from the previous question, because, and I refer to the Dutch experience, because the Dutch always have been quoted in many presentations as a success story, which it is. But climate change has very different threats to us, and maybe we should start to look at nature in different contexts, in different locales, in a different way. We always talk about adaptation, but whether that is absolute or a hypothesis, and whether we need to look at protectionism as much as adaptation, and very subtle difference, but huge investment in those two aspects.
Any quick comments on that observation?
Nothing from me, thank you.
No, horses for courses, if you want to be cliched about it, but we've got to look at, as I said earlier, protection, adaptation. I think the Dutch is an interesting model, definitely, but it may be also that what was good for Holland 100 years ago may not be good for Holland in 100 years' time.
In terms of the natural environment, then, I mean, adaptation is absolutely where it has to be. And what we have to try to do is to facilitate and allow it, because there are things we can't protect. And I think species migration is probably one of the things that, we can work with in a lot of ways, which is, making sure that we build the networks of green infrastructure that allow species migration to happen, because it's something that will be gradual and it will take time to do. We also have to acknowledge that things that grow in this country now may well cease to grow in this country, and that new things will be required to take their places. We can't predict, I think, at all where it's going to go, because it's just going to happen. So we have to do the best we can to enable adaptation to happen, but and I don't want to use the word preserve or protect, because with climate change, there is a limited amount that we can do. We can work with it as best we can to preserve what we can, where we can, but not by, we could be quite ridiculous about it. So we can facilitate that and enable habitats to stay where they are and to move, and I think it's this whole species migration. It's a very, very complex subject to try to work with, but we have to work towards adaptation as much as we can. You need about an hour or two to talk about that one. Hope that helps.
Well, thank you. We're up against our time limit now, so thank you very much to our three speakers. If you just show your appreciation again in the usual way. Thank you.
You're going to have to shoot.
You have to get this on.